July 25, 1944, 9:30 in the morning. At an unnamed crossroads west of Sonlo, Normandy. The morning air hangs thick with moisture and the false silence that only a battlefield can produce. That particular quiet every combat veteran knows. The kind that feels wrong. Deep beneath the surface. Inside a command bunker reinforced with ancient oak timbers, sat Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein. If you're a student of World War II history, and I suspect most of you are, that name needs no introduction. Bayerlein was a living legend. A seasoned commander who had breathed the desert dust of North Africa alongside Field Marshal Rommel himself. He could read a battle through instinct and a lifetime of hard-won experience. He could gauge the rhythm of a fight from the sound of tank treads in the distance, from the smell of cordite drifting across a field. And on this particular morning, he held in his hands the finest armored division the Third Reich had ever fielded on the Western Front. The Panzer Lehr division. That word, Lehr, means teaching in German. The name was not chosen lightly. This division wasn't assembled from fresh-faced recruits. It was built from the very best instructors of Germany's armored warfare schools. Every tank driver, every gunner, every radio operator was a master of his craft. They had spent their careers teaching others the art of mechanized warfare. Now they were practicing it with cold, surgical precision, and they had stopped the American advance dead in its tracks for 6 brutal weeks. Bayerlein stood before his operations map with quiet satisfaction. He had good reason to feel confident. In those 6 weeks, he had transformed the gentle Norman countryside into something genuinely terrifying. He had exploited the bocage, that ancient network of hedgerows defining this corner of France, with the instincts of a natural-born defender. To a French farmer, those hedgerows were property lines. To Bayerlein, they were gifts from God. He had positioned his Panther tanks, magnificent 45-ton machines, hull down behind reverse slopes where American gunners couldn't touch them. He had buried his anti-tank guns in the undergrowth, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned every narrow lane into a killing ground. Layer upon layer of mutually supporting positions made every yard of ground cost the Americans dearly. And cost them it had. The United States First Army had bled for 6 weeks trying to crack this defense. 40,000 American casualties. Barely 11 kilometers of ground gained. The fields around Sonlo were littered with the burnt-out hulks of Sherman tanks, black and skeletal against the green Norman fields. Silent monuments to German defensive doctrine. Bayerlein checked his watch. 9:35. He stepped outside, lit a cigarette, and ran through the calculations in his mind. The Americans would attack again soon. They'd pound his lines with artillery, then send infantry up the same corridors they'd tried before. And his men would stop them. Again. As they had done a dozen times already. But here's what matters most about Fritz Bayerlein on this particular morning. He was a brilliant man operating with a fatally flawed set of assumptions. He was reading this war through the lens of every war that had come before it. He believed, genuinely, deeply, that this fight would be decided by who shot straighter, who hit better, who held their nerve when the pressure came. He believed the quality of his soldiers and the strength of his positions would offset any material advantage the Americans might bring. He did not know that at airfields across southern England, a decision had already been made. A decision that had nothing to do with tactics or courage. A decision rooted entirely in industrial capacity and the cold arithmetic of mass production. And as Bayerlein drew on that first cigarette, the sky to the north was already beginning to darken. Not with clouds. With aluminium. He was standing on a square of the map already marked for erasure. Death was coming, not in the form of a soldier or a tank, but in the form of an industrial assembly line running at full capacity. 30,000 feet overhead. The trap was set. The prey was in position. The machinery was already in motion. For half a century, Prussian military doctrine had been built on a foundation that felt less like strategy and more like religion. A creed. Simple, powerful, and deeply seductive. Quality always defeats quantity. One well-trained soldier is worth 10 amateurs. One precision-engineered weapon will destroy 5 mass-produced ones. The superior warrior, properly led and equipped, will overcome numerical disadvantage through skill and force of will. Fritz Bayerlein was the finest product that philosophy had ever produced. He had watched it work. He had lived it working. In Poland. In France in 1940. In the early years of the Eastern Front, German armored spearheads routinely tore through larger formations because they moved faster, thought faster, and coordinated their arms in ways opponents couldn't match. The philosophy had been validated, over and over, in blood and fire across the whole of Europe. So when Bayerlein looked at the American forces arrayed against him at Sonlo, he felt something closer to professional contempt than fear. Not contempt for the individual American soldier, he credited them with basic courage, but contempt for the entire American approach to warfare. In his assessment, the Americans fought like wealthy amateurs. They were loud, wasteful, and thoroughly dependent on material superiority as a substitute for tactical skill. They burned through ammunition at rates that would horrify a German quartermaster. When things got difficult, they went to ground and called for air support rather than pushing through with cold steel. And then there was the Sherman tank. If you know your World War II armor, you know the Sherman's reputation. It was a product of Detroit, reliable, easy to manufacture, easy to maintain, and deeply outclassed in a straight fight against its German counterparts. Its 75mm gun could penetrate a Panther's front armor only at near point-blank range. Under ideal conditions, with a prayer attached, its armor was thin enough that a well-placed German anti-tank round would punch straight through at distances, giving the gunner time to reload and do it again. And the fuel system. The Sherman ran on high-octane gasoline. One penetrating hit in the right place and that tank became a furnace. The Germans called it the Tommy Cooker. American tankers called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose advertisement boasted it at first time. Every time. The men who drove Shermans didn't find that funny at all. The battlefield exchange rate confirmed Bayerlein's confidence in brutal statistical terms. On average, it took 5 Sherman tanks to kill 1 Panther. 5 to 1. He could live with those numbers all day long. And then there was the terrain. The bocage wasn't simply vegetation. It was a natural fortress system optimized for defense over centuries of agricultural use. Those sunken lanes winding between fields ran below the level of surrounding ground. Their earthen banks reinforced by oak roots 200 years old. A Sherman trying to push through a hedgerow had to climb the bank nose first, exposing its thin belly armor to any German anti-tank weapon within range. This problem haunted American tank crews through those early weeks. Every hedgerow crossing was a potential death sentence. And because the lanes were so narrow and the vegetation so dense, you couldn't maneuver around the problem. You had to go through it. Bayerlein had positioned his anti-tank guns specifically to exploit this. Hidden in the shadows, angled to catch the exposed belly of a climbing Sherman. A single gun crew could hold a lane against an entire company of tanks. The math was murderously simple. So there he stood, this brilliant, experienced, supremely confident general, with his expert crews, his excellent tanks, and his ideal defensive terrain, looking across no man's land and thinking, I can hold this forever. He was wrong. Not because he'd miscalculated the courage of his men. He was wrong because he was solving the right problem with the wrong mental framework. He was thinking about this battle as a contest between warriors. A question of who was better, faster, more skilled. The Americans had stopped thinking about it that way entirely. On the other side of the wire, the men making decisions about Sonlo weren't reading military theory. They were reading production schedules. They weren't asking how do we outfight Panzer Lehr. They were asking a fundamentally different question: what is the most efficient process for removing a physical obstacle from a geographic coordinate? Bayerlein was preparing for a duel. The Americans were preparing a demolition job. General Omar Nelson Bradley did not look like a man capable of ordering the industrial-scale erasure of 20,000 soldiers. He looked like a high school principal. Slightly rumpled. Wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of face you'd trust to give you honest directions if you were lost in a small town. His soldiers called him the GI's general. And they meant it as the highest compliment. He was known for walking the front lines, eating from the same mess kits as his men, and genuinely losing sleep over casualty reports. Which is precisely why, when he looked at the figures coming across his desk in late July 1944, something cold and mathematical settled over him. 40,000 American casualties. 6 weeks of fighting. 11 kilometers of ground. The numbers were unsustainable. Washington was pressing for results. The public at home, pinning maps to their living room walls, tracking the arrows with anxious fingers, expected Paris liberated before the leaves turned. And here was Bradley. His first army bleeding out in the Norman hedgerows. His best divisions chewed up against defenses that showed no signs of cracking. Something had to change. Not tactically. Not strategically. Fundamentally. He needed to stop playing the game Bayerlein was winning and invent a new game entirely. The solution he arrived at was breathtaking in its audacity. It was also, when you strip away the military terminology and look at it clearly, an act of almost philosophical violence against the concept of a fair fight. He called it Operation Cobra. The concept was elegantly brutal. Instead of finding a way through the bocage, the Americans would simply eliminate it. Instead of fighting Panzer Lehr on its own terms, they would make the question of fighting irrelevant. And Bradley intended to accomplish this with a weapon never before used for this purpose. Strategic bombers flying close air support. Now, stop and consider how radical that idea was in 1944. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were designed to fly 1,000 miles, navigate through flak and fighter opposition, and put bombs on industrial targets deep inside enemy territory. They were sledgehammers of the strategic air campaign, blunt, powerful instruments built for a very specific purpose. Using them to support ground troops in a fluid tactical situation, where your own men might be a few hundred yards from the target, was the kind of idea most military professionals would dismiss as either brilliant or insane. Probably both. The margin for error in close air support is measured in yards. The margin for error in strategic bombing is measured in miles. Combining the two was a gamble that could just as easily kill Americans as Germans. Bradley knew this. He took the bet anyway. He drew a rectangle on his operations map. 6 kilometers long. 2 kilometers wide. Centered on Panzer Lehr's main defensive position. He ordered his frontline troops to pull back a minimum of 1.200 yards from the near edge of that rectangle. He had artillery observers fire colored smoke rounds to mark the four corners of the target zone the night before. And into that zone, he planned to deliver something with no precedent in the history of land warfare. 1,500 heavy bombers. 4,000 tons of high explosives. Let me put those numbers in perspective. Because raw figures have a way of sliding past us without leaving a mark. The total combat weight of the Panzer Lehr division, every 45-ton Panther, every self-propelled gun, every truck, every ammunition trailer, and every pound of flesh belonging to its 20,000 soldiers, has been estimated at somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 tons. Bradley was proposing to drop a weight of ordnance roughly equivalent to the entire physical mass of the enemy division onto the division. Not over a week. Not across multiple raids spread over several days. In 60 minutes. 1 hour. It took the German Luftwaffe over a year of sustained bombing to deliver a comparable tonnage against Britain during the Blitz. The Americans were going to do it between breakfast and lunch. This was not a battle plan in any traditional sense. This was an assembly line running at maximum capacity, with destruction as the finished product. Bradley wasn't trying to outfight Panzer Lehr. He was trying to physically negate its existence at a specific geographic coordinate through the application of industrial-scale energy. Back in his bunker west of Sonlo, Fritz Bayerlein had no idea his position had been reduced to a set of coordinates on a targeting chart. He didn't know that the colored smoke drifting up from several points near his lines the previous evening were not American signal markers. They were the corner posts of his coffin. Before we follow Bayerlein into those final moments before the sky fell, I want to take a few minutes to explain something that most accounts of Operation Cobra overlook entirely. Most histories focus on the drama, the waves of bombers, the walls of fire, the chaos and destruction. But to truly understand why Panzer Lehr had no meaningful chance of survival, you need to look at this through the lens of physics rather than tactics. Because what happened on July 25 wasn't really a military operation in the traditional sense. It was the application of industrial energy to a bounded physical space. And the results followed natural laws as surely as water flowing downhill. Let's start with what engineers call area saturation. When you detonate 4,000 tons of explosives within a confined space over a short period, the individual bombs stop behaving like individual bombs. They stop being discrete events that a soldier might survive by being in the right place at the right time. Instead, the shock waves from thousands of near-simultaneous detonations don't cancel each other out, they compound. They stack. They reinforce each other, creating pressure conditions that no structure above ground, and precious few structures below ground, can withstand. The carpet bombing at Sunlow was designed to achieve exactly this saturation condition. The bombs didn't fall one at a time. They fell in dense curtains, hundreds at a time, walking across the target zone in systematic patterns. The effect wasn't explosion followed by explosion. It was one continuous, sustained physical convulsion of the earth. Now consider what that does to the human body. The human body is a pressurized biological system full of air-filled cavities, your lungs, your sinuses, your middle ear. Under normal conditions, the pressure inside these cavities is in equilibrium with the outside air. When a blast wave passes through you, it disrupts that equilibrium violently. The pressure outside spikes to many times normal atmospheric levels in a fraction of a second, then drops below ambient almost as fast. Your body cannot adapt quickly enough. Alveoli rupture. Blood vessels in the brain snap. Eardrums disintegrate. A German soldier could be positioned in a reinforced concrete bunker, with no fragment of shrapnel coming within 20 feet of him, and still die from blast overpressure alone. His body might show no obvious external wound, but internally, he'd look like he'd been through a ringer, burst lungs, hemorrhaged brain tissue, ruptured organs, death that came in silence, invisibly, through the very air he was breathing. Then there's what the explosives did to the ground itself. Soil under normal conditions has what geologists call shear strength, the ability to resist lateral forces and maintain its structure. Subject that soil to repeated massive impacts over a short period and you can destroy that shear strength temporarily. The soil particles, normally locked together by friction and root systems, begin behaving more like a dense fluid than a solid. Engineers call this liquefaction. Those 45-ton Panther tanks, in their carefully chosen fighting positions, suddenly found themselves sitting in something that wasn't quite solid anymore. The vibration of thousands of nearby explosions broke down the surrounding soil's load-bearing capacity. Tanks that had been stable began to settle, shift, and tilt. Some were swallowed by the very earth they'd been hiding in, dirt cascading down around them, blocking hatches, clogging engine air intakes, sealing crews inside as effectively as welding the exits shut. Those men didn't die from penetrating rounds. They died in the dark, in machines that had become tombs, from oxygen depletion and carbon monoxide from their own engines struggling to run in an atmosphere choked with combustion products. And then came the incendiaries. After the high explosive bombs had torn up the surface, shattered the bunkers, and overturned the tanks, the napalm arrived. It soaked into the churned earth. It clung to twisted metal. It ran down into broken bunkers. The oxygen sustaining human life was consumed by fire faster than it could be replaced. Men who had survived the blast phase, who had pressed themselves into the earth and prayed, those men now found themselves in spaces where breathing had become an act of self-destruction. Consider the mathematics one final time. 4,000 tons over 60 minutes. Roughly 1 ton of high explosives detonating every single second. Without pause. For an hour, imagine watching a full-sized automobile made entirely of TNT explode in your driveway. Then imagine it happening again. And again. Every second. For 60 minutes straight. That is what the men of Panzer Lehr experienced on the morning of July 25, 1944. There was no tactical response to this. No positioning. No maneuver. No act of individual courage could alter the equation. The finest armored division on the Western Front had been reduced to a physics problem. And the solution had been calculated in advance. In quiet offices. By men holding slide rules rather than rifles. The warriors were about to meet the engineers. And the engineers had done their homework. At 9:38 in the morning, Fritz Bayerlein heard something. It started as a vibration more than a sound, a low, subliminal throbbing he felt in his chest before his ears registered it consciously. He stepped out of his command bunker, shaded his eyes against the morning sun, and looked north. What he saw stopped him where he stood. The sky, which moments before had been clear and ordinary, was filled with aircraft. Not a flight. Not a squadron. An entire horizon full of them. Stretching east to west as far as he could see. Moving steadily south in formations so dense they seemed to darken the day like an oncoming storm. B-17s and B-24s. More than 1,500 of them. Their silver fuselages catching the morning light. From the ground. The sound was unlike anything in his experience. Not the sharp crack of fighters or the intermittent rumble of a tactical raid. This was a continuous, enormous mechanical roar, the combined voice of thousands of aircraft engines, that shook the air like the approach of something geological. Bayerlein was not a man who frightened easily. He had stood in the open under Stuka attacks in the desert. He had commanded from exposed positions while artillery fell around him. But looking up at that river of aluminium stretching across the entire northern sky, something shifted in his understanding of the situation. He reached for his radio to order his units to take cover. The radio was already dead. The artillery observers who had fired those smoke rounds the night before had done their job with precision. The four corners of the target box were marked. And the lead bombardier in the lead aircraft was at that moment looking through his Norden bomb sight at those smoke columns, making final adjustments, while 1,500 aircraft behind him flew in trail and waited for his signal. The trap had been constructed with a thoroughness that went beyond military planning into something almost architectural. The road network behind Panzer Lehr had been interdicted by previous air attacks. Supply routes that might have allowed units to displace were already damaged. Communications had been systematically degraded by artillery in the preceding days. So that when the bombing started, Bayerlein's ability to coordinate any response would be severed almost immediately. His men were exactly where the Americans needed them to be. And the discipline that kept them there, the Wehrmacht's legendary Durchhalten, the hold-fast orders flowing directly from Hitler's headquarters, had become, in this specific moment, a death sentence. The order not to yield ground, not to abandon positions without authorization from above, meant that 20,000 men were anchored in place inside a box about to receive 4,000 tons of ordnance. Bayerlein's greatest strength had become his cage. He tried reaching his forward battalions by telephone. Lines had been cut by preliminary artillery. He tried the radio again. Static. He sent motorcycle dispatch riders forward. They didn't come back. In the target zone, his soldiers were doing what soldiers do when something large and terrible approaches. They were pressing themselves into the earth, pulling helmets down, checking weapons, a purely instinctive gesture of reassurance that had no practical value against what was coming. Some were praying. Many had simply frozen. transfixed by the impossible scale of what they were hearing overhead. The lead aircraft reached its release point at 9:40 a.m. The bombardier, a 23-year-old from Ohio who had probably been thinking about breakfast 20 minutes earlier, made one small, practiced movement. His hand found the release lever and pulled it. 2 words came through the aircraft's intercom in a flat, business-like tone. "Bombs away." Spoken with the same casual voice a truck driver might use to say right turn. 2 words that were the signal for the largest single application of air-delivered firepower in direct support of a ground operation the Western Front had ever seen. In the bomb bays of 1,500 aircraft, release mechanisms tripped in sequence. 4,000 tons of ordnance began their 30-second fall toward the Norman countryside below. Bayerlein heard the subtle change in pitch overhead, that slight shift when aircraft that have just released their loads become fractionally lighter and their engines change their note. Any man who has been under a bombing raid learns to recognize that sound. He knew exactly what it meant. He dove back into his bunker. The world ended 40 seconds later. Not metaphorically. For the 20,000 men of Panzer Lehr positioned inside that rectangle. The world they had known, the world of tactics, positions, command relationships, and defensive doctrine, simply ceased to exist. It was replaced by something for which the German military vocabulary, rich as it was, had no adequate word. The first impacts hit at 9:40 and 20 seconds. When the sky fell. There's a particular challenge in describing what happened inside the Panzer Lehr sector between 9:40 and 10:40 on the morning of July 25. The problem isn't a lack of information, we have survivor accounts, after-action reports, and Bayerlein's own testimony given to Allied interrogators after the war. The problem is that the human brain, which evolved to process individual threats in sequence, struggles to reconstruct what it means for everything to happen at once. So let me walk you through it in layers. The first impact sounds were not the discrete crump of artillery rounds that veteran soldiers learned to track and locate. They were a rolling, overlapping concatenation of detonations that merged almost immediately into a single sustained physical presence. Veterans described it not as a sound but as a state, like being inside a drum someone was striking continuously. Without pause, without rhythm, just constant percussive force transmitted simultaneously through the earth beneath them and the air around them. Bayerlein's command bunker lurched. Not swayed, lurched. The distinction matters. Because swaying implies a return to center. This structure was being struck repeatedly from multiple directions by blast waves arriving fractions of a second apart, creating a random, violent, disorienting motion that no timber bracing could fully resist. Soil rained from the ceiling. The electric lights went out instantly. The thick hook beams groaned and cracked in a way that suggested they were discovering their limits. Bayerlein was thrown against the wall. He got to his knees. The floor was still moving. He stayed on his knees. Outside, the bocage, those ancient earthen banks that had been the entire foundation of the German defensive scheme, simply ceased to exist inside the target zone. Earthen banks standing for centuries, reinforced by oak roots 200 years old, were excavated by blast and flung aside. What had been, minutes before, a landscape of dense vegetation and enclosed spaces became, within the first 5 minutes, something resembling a World War I artillery zone. The craters overlapped immediately. There was no intact surface remaining between impact points. The ground became a continuous series of interconnected holes, their edges already collapsing into each other as the surrounding soil liquefied from repeated shocks. Moving across this terrain on foot would have been nearly impossible even without the ongoing bombardment. The Panther tanks were dealt with in ways ranging from the spectacular to the quietly terrible. The spectacular, several tanks in forward positions took near-miss impacts that detonated their ammunition stores. A Panther carries dozens of main gun rounds in its ready rack and internal stowage. When those rounds cook off simultaneously, the results are catastrophic. Turrets weighing 12 tons were blown completely free of the hull, sometimes landing 50 yards away. Hull sections were peeled open like tin cans. The quietly terrible, some tanks in more protected positions were not directly destroyed. They were simply buried. The ground around them, liquefied by repeated blast impacts, flowed back and settled around the hull, up to the turret ring. Hatches couldn't be forced open against the weight of settled earth. Engine air intakes, clogged with debris, starved the motors of oxygen. Carbon monoxide built up inside the sealed fighting compartment. The crew, uninjured by any direct hit, asphyxiated in the dark. When these tanks were eventually excavated, crews were found in their positions, the driver's hands still on the steering levers, the gunner's eye still pressed against the sight. Death had come quietly, in darkness, while outside the world was being unmade. The infantry in the forward trenches experienced something that German after-action reports struggled to characterize in standard military terminology. The word appearing most frequently across multiple survivor accounts is Wahnsinnig, madness. Not as a description of enemy tactics, but as a description of what the bombing did to men's minds. The continuous blast over pressure, sustained over 60 minutes, caused cumulative neurological damage that outwardly resembled acute psychiatric crisis. Men who survived without physical wounds were found wandering in circles, unable to state their unit or rank, unable to recognize officers they had served alongside for years. Their brains had been physically damaged by repeated shock loading beyond the tissue's design tolerance. One surviving officer described watching his company's sergeant, a 4-year Eastern Front veteran, a man he had personally seen direct fire calmly under artillery barrages that would break most men, standing in an open field during a brief pause between impacts, screaming orders at soldiers who weren't there. The sergeant's uniform was intact. No blood. But the man behind the eyes was gone. Bayerlein finally forced his bunker door open against the weight of debris piled against it and looked out. He had commanded men on battlefields from North Africa to Normandy. He had seen destruction on a scale most people cannot imagine. He was not a man given to dramatic language in his official reports. In his after-action account, he used the phrase Mondlandschaft, moon landscape. It was the most accurate description possible. The reckoning. At 10:40 a.m., the last formation of B-17s dropped its final bombs and banked northward toward England. The engines faded. The curtain of explosions drew back. And across the target zone west of Sonlo, a particular kind of silence settled, not the ordinary silence of a quiet morning, but the weighted, oppressive silence that follows catastrophic violence. The silence of a place where the normal rules of the world no longer seem to apply. The dust didn't settle immediately. It hung in the air, a massive billowing cloud of pulverized soil, atomized concrete, and combustion products that turned the midday sun into a pale yellow disk. The light reaching the ground was sallow and strange, giving everything the quality of an old photograph left in the sun too long. Fritz Bayerlein moved through what remained of his command area. The Panzer Lehr division had been, 12 hours earlier, the finest armored formation on the Western Front. Its soldiers weren't simply well trained, they were the men who had written the training manuals. Its commanders possessed a combined depth of combat experience no allied formation could match. Its equipment was among the best the German war industry could produce. None of that had mattered. He found a Panther tank lying on its back in a bomb crater. Tracks pointing at the sky. Turret driven into the ground by the force of impact that had flipped it. The hatches, designed to open outward, were pinned shut by the weight of the inverted hull. He put his ear against the steel. From inside, faintly, he could hear something. He stepped back. The sound had stopped. He found the remnants of an infantry platoon, 17 men huddled in a section of trench that had partially survived. They were alive. Most were uninjured in the conventional sense. But when his aide spoke to them, asking for their unit designation and the location of their commanding officer, They looked back with the blank expression of men asked a question in a language they don't quite recognize. Their sergeant, a veteran of Russia with the Iron Cross First Class on his chest, sat against the trench wall methodically loading and unloading the same rifle magazine. Over and over. With the focused concentration of a man performing a task requiring all his attention. He would still be doing it 3 hours later. When the American medics found him, Bayerlein tried to establish communications with his forward battalions. Runners didn't return. Telephone lines were gone. Radio produced nothing but static. He was, for the first time in his career, a general without an army, not because the army had run away, but because the army had been physically deleted from the landscape around him. At approximately 11:15, from the north, came a sound every combat soldier learns to recognize immediately. Tank tracks on broken ground. But the cadence was wrong. The pitch different. These were the Ford V8 engines of the Sherman tank, lighter, higher revving. Unmistakable to anyone who had spent weeks listening to their German counterparts. The American armor was moving forward. And what struck Bayerlein, what struck every German survivor who later described this moment, was the pace of the advance. The Americans weren't rushing. They were moving carefully, methodically, at the cautious speed of men expecting resistance. But there was no resistance. The Shermans rolled through the obliterated landscape and nothing stopped them. Not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because the soldiers who might have stopped them had been removed from the equation by a process that had nothing to do with courage on either side. Bayerlein issued the order to withdraw. Preserve what remained. Pull back before exploitation accelerated and turned retreat into rout. The order went out through whatever improvised communications he could scrape together. Roughly a third of the division was beyond receiving any orders at all. As his command vehicle moved south, away from the smoke column still rising from the target zone in a plume visible for 30 miles, Bayerlein began to write down what he had witnessed. The after-action report he produced in the following days is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of armored warfare. It contains none of the usual professional deflection, no careful management of institutional reputation. It is an honest man's attempt to describe something his entire professional framework had not prepared him to encounter. The passage quoted most often by historians reads, in translation, "My division is destroyed. 2/3 of the men are either dead or in shock. The vehicles are buried or burning. The landscape no longer exists. What was a defensive line this morning is now only a geographic expression on a map." That last phrase, a geographic expression on a map. Think about what it means for a man who built his entire professional identity on the relationship between ground and tactics, to describe a physical location as no longer existing in any meaningful military sense. The operational results confirmed what Bayerlein's instincts had already told him. Within 48 hours, American armored columns were pouring through the gap that Panzer Lehr's destruction had opened. The German defensive crust shattered along its entire width. Within a week, American forces had broken out of Normandy entirely, driving east across open country at speeds German staff officers could barely track on their maps. The campaign that Bayerlein's defense had stalled for 6 weeks was over in 6 days. Panzer Lehr never fully recovered. It fought on. The German army had a remarkable capacity for reconstituting shattered formations, but it fought on as a shadow of what it had been. It would appear again at the Bulge, in the defense of Germany itself, but never again with the combination of experienced personnel and first-rate equipment that had made it. On July 24, 1944, the most dangerous division on the Western Front. What does all of this mean? For those of us who've spent enough years watching the world to understand that the lessons of the past have a way of coming around again, the Panzer Lehr division was destroyed not because its soldiers lacked courage, or because its commanders lacked skill, or because its equipment was inadequate. It was destroyed because it was operating with a mental model of warfare that American industrial capacity had simply rendered obsolete. The Germans were playing chess. The Americans had brought a bulldozer to the chessboard. Bayerlein spent years after the war trying to articulate what he had witnessed that morning. In interviews, in his memoirs, in accounts given to historians who sought him out in the 1950s and 60s, he kept returning to the same theme: the moment he realized that willpower, skill, and tactical genius were irrelevant variables in an equation being solved by industrial capacity alone. That recognition is the human heart of this story. Not the bombs, not the machines, but a brilliant man standing in the ruins of everything he knew how to do, watching American tanks roll past him unchallenged, understanding with perfect clarity that the future belonged to a different way of thinking entirely. That's where we'll leave Fritz Bayerlein, standing in the dust of Sonlo, watching the world he understood disappear over the southern horizon. Thank you for spending this time with us on the World War II Dossiers-Podcast. If this account gave you something to think about, we'd be grateful for your subscription and a like on this video. It genuinely helps us bring these stories to more people who care about getting history right. We tell these stories from an honest angle, not just from the perspective of the victors, but from the point of view of every man who lived through these events, on whatever side of the wire he happened to be standing. Drop us a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us what battles you'd like us to cover next. There are plenty more stories like this one, moments where history turned on something unexpected, something human, something the textbooks summarize in 2 sentences but that deserves 2 hours. We'll see you in the next one.